it does look like we have slowed down the large crowd wanting to come into the room. So it's always good. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Dr. Mike Searcy. I teach communication here at Somerset Community College 2 days a week at the main campus, and then I get the pleasure of running down to McCreary County in Whitley City to teach at the McCreary Center 2 days a week. And for those of you that also teach and work here at the college, I'm sorry, but only so many of us can work in McCreary County, and I just get lucky. No kidding, I actually have a really, really good time down there. We're going to talk a little bit about conflict management today, specifically about communication climates and setting up those communication climates that we have in any relationship, any interpersonal relationship that we're involved in, so that conflict, if the communication climate is set up, that conflict can also be managed that much easier as well if we set it up correctly. Let's look at page 2 of the workbook that I've given you at this point. The Scottish philosopher David Hume once said in the 1700s that grief and disappointment give rise to anger. Anger to envy, envy to malice, and malice to grief again, till the whole circle be completed. Those are real positive thoughts, aren't they? In many respects, what we're often talking about, whether we get on track of a negative cycle or get on track of a positive cycle, this is all often due directly to our own decisions and how we set up our own relationships and the atmosphere within our own relationships. Pardon me. One of the things that we have to realize is that conflict happens, and only happens, between people, believe it or not, that matter. At this point, we realize that the opposite of love isn't necessarily hate, it's apathy, right? The opposite of love is apathy. There's no conflict with people who just don't care one way or the other what happens to us. And yet there seems to be conflict, sometimes bordering on hate, ultimately if there's some semblance of care and concern in that other person for the decisions we make or how we live our lives. And so when we start to look at the fact that there's conflict existing at all, one of the things that we can be assured of and somewhat gratified in is the fact that the mere fact that conflict exists is that people actually care. If they didn't care and they were apathetic, there wouldn't be any conflict. And because we talk about the conflict happening between people who matter, it also becomes somewhat, if they matter a lot, or the issue matters a lot, it can sometimes become more volatile. Hence, we like to put in some levity in this. And if you look at the cartoon there, we can see what we presume to be a father talking to, presumptuously, the son, who says to the son, "This is where your mother and I had our first argument." And you can see the earth shook, or had at least some kind of explosion of some sort. How we act and how we manage conflict is also what often shows where our character lies. This is why it's important. Martin Luther King Jr. once said that the ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and convenience. When everything is going really well and really easy, it's very easy for us to be happy and to get along with others. When things aren't going so well, character has a tendency to come forward. That second half of the quote, "But where he stands at times of challenge and controversy," what? That's where the measure of our character really shines forward. It's in conflict, it's in crisis. Turn over to page 3. What am I talking about here? I'm talking about crafting and creating communication climates, or positive communication climates. So what's a communication climate? The overall feeling or emotional mood between people. The overall feeling or the emotional mood between people. We get involved with people and we see people and all of a sudden we're happy because the exchanges that happen between us and them, we're always happy exchanges. Or they're not so happy, and we kind of groan and we brace ourselves because here comes that person. And every time we deal with that person, it's kind of anxious. It makes us anxious and kind of makes us nervous. The communication climate is the overall feeling or emotional mood between people, whether that's warm or cold, safe or anxious, comfortable or awkward, accepting or rejecting, open or guarded. And that overall feeling or emotional mood is shaped by verbal and nonverbal interaction between people. Learning how communication shapes communication climates basically empowers us to sustain positive communication climates. We could ask you to come on over here. Thanks. All right, so point to ponder as we're looking at this. How do we treat others around us to build a positive communication climate in which conflict may be treated positively rather than negatively? This is something that I think we ought to pay attention to in our daily lives with every relationship, every interaction that we have. Now, if we look at the origin of the word conflict, what does it mean? Now, a little later on, we're going to talk about the fact that meaning happens to lie within people and not within words. So let's look at the word, though, and the kind of meaning we as people might put in that word. Conflict, it's from the Latin confligere, which means to strike together. To strike together. Now, if we focus for a moment on that word strike, is it any wonder why many of us actually think of conflict in the negative? That, oh, it must be a negative thing. Is there any wonder why we might look at conflict as negative with the word strike together? Because when we think about the word strike, we often are thinking about hitting, somehow getting at, attacking. I don't know about you, but I happen to be originally from Chicago. It's a very unionized town. Strike has a very different word, a very different meaning. And it really talks about people acting in unison for a unified goal. And to get results. And those are two very different perspectives. And in one perspective, we often look at the word strike and think of it in terms of negativity. And other times, we might look at this and think very positive. So having said that, looking at conflict and recognizing we can look at it very positive, recognizing that we might look at it negatively, let's look at the principles of conflict. The first is, conflict is natural in relationships. As we just talked about a moment ago, conflict is natural because people matter to each other. And because they matter to each other, and we might be concerned about the people we care about and the decisions that they're making, if we don't agree with those decisions for whatever reason, how it affects us, for example, then it matters and conflict might occur. Number two, conflict may be expressed overtly or covertly. What's overtly mean? Out in the open. Out in the open. Good. Good. Overtly, conflict may be expressed, and we might talk about this in terms of explicit discussion, heated debates, having our say, hearing me out. Or in the extreme, we might talk about physical violence, right? You know, I used to own a bar. I used to own a bartending school. And it never occurs to me until you own a bar or spend a lot of time in a bar, for instance, just how much conflict people have, because not people matter, but people's space matter. What I'm talking about here, you know, that person who gets up, leaves their drink after they've had a few, they go to use the restroom, they come back, someone else is sitting in their stool. How quickly sometimes physical violence might occur. Very overt. It may be expressed overtly, positively, or negatively, is the point I'm making. Or it might also be expressed covertly. What's covertly mean? Hidden, yeah. Are we familiar with the term passive-aggressive? You know, a lot of us are familiar with that term, passive-aggressive, but it's really interesting to find out that when we ask somebody, give me a good definition of passive-aggressive, what does it mean? All of a sudden we're stretching. Because we kind of think we know what it means, but oftentimes we can't quite put our finger on it, And that kind of gets at the definition of hidden, though, doesn't it? Passive-aggressive. Acting aggressively while denying it, right? Acting aggressively while denying acting aggressive. So how might that occur? It might occur, covert conflict might occur negatively, and they reflect that we might have people who use what we call the blemish game. We familiar with the blemish game? You know, that outfit that you're wearing, it really, really looked good on you last week. I really like your last haircut. And so it almost sounds like we're giving a compliment, but there's a veiled insult in there, isn't there? The blemish game. We might also know this as the cold shoulder, right? But we got to be real careful when we give somebody the cold shoulder, and we're not going to actually give them the time of day, because if people think you talk too much already, they might actually welcome the silence. Or as one of my favorite, the NIGYYSOB. The NIGYYSOB. It's an acronym for Now I Got You, USOB. What am I talking about here? You know, it's amazing because let's say that we are working together at the same place and I happen to know that you're just not good at details. And somebody comes to me and says, I need somebody to head up this project. Who do you suggest? And the project is full of details. And so I immediately recommend you. Why? Because now I got you. I know you're not going to be able to pull this off. And so we set you up. Now I got you. Watch. I recommended you and you let us all down. Well, we knew you weren't good with details, and yet we pushed it anyway. Or we know the people that play the game that I call mine is worse than yours. You want to go and complain and tell somebody about something, and then they immediately go off about how, well, their problems are worse than yours, so yours really don't matter. Or my favorite, the yes but game. You need some help. You need some help. And so you come to me and say, hey, wait a minute, I'm having trouble in math. And your immediate response is, I'll tell you what, I'll tutor you in math. We'll take care of that for you. And your response at that point is, yes, but I can't meet at the time that you're available. I'll tell you what, let me hook you up with this other tutor. Yes, but I don't like that person. And maybe you come up with 2 or 3 more different solutions to that problem. And they've got a quick, yes, but... And then they go away figuring, you're not willing to help them. So who won that game? Covert conflict isn't, in fact, it's mostly never positive. Covert expression of conflict is mostly never positive. It's dishonest because it camouflages people's feelings, doesn't it? Alright, so conflict may be expressed overtly or covertly. Social groups share the meaning of conflict behaviors. Meaning lies within people, not within words. Meaning lies within people, not within words. If I held this up and I asked all of you quickly, what is this? What do we call this? A pen, thank you. There is no intrinsic connection between the word pen and this item right here. If there was, we'd all be speaking around the globe the exact same language. So if we had decided at this point that we were all going to refer to this as an apple, what is this? It's an apple, because we decided. My mother used to always tell me to go pick up my floor. Now, if I was paying attention to the words, and as a wise guy little child, I'd look at her and I'd go, I don't have a crowbar. Or at that point, she'd quickly revise and say, well, go pick up all the things off your floor. We got to go. I said, okay. I'd run into the room, pick it all up, throw it in the bed. did what she said until she eventually started looking at me, and again, she'd constantly say, do what I mean, not what I say. Now, as a child, hearing that out of context, you might think, what in the world does that mean? Well, she knew full well I knew what it meant at any rate. Social groups share the meaning of conflict behaviors. Sometimes we see people yelling and screaming at each other. You know, we've watched television shows. I assume that the television shows probably on reruns. Everybody loves Raymond. You've seen this? And the parents on that show are always yelling and screaming at each other. This is just their normal communicative behavior. That if it happened in my house, we'd look around and go, they're about ready to kill each other. You know, call the police. Because in some households, they just don't raise their voices. And in some households, the higher the volume just indicates how much more they care. Yes, you can take that home and say you heard it here first. We also know that conflict can be managed well or it can be managed poorly. And that conflict can be good for individuals and relationships. How do we learn about each other? How do we learn what our limits are? How do we learn where our lines of ethics and morals and decisions really lie? Oftentimes it's through conflict. And through the practice of conflict and actually going through these motions, we can learn a lot more about each other and grow. Of course, you know, you're gonna hear me yammer on and on about this stuff. I'm gonna have to throw in another cartoon, right? And so, especially when we talk about meanings lie within people and not words, what does the husband, I assume, say to the wife here? Well, if it doesn't matter who's right and who's wrong, why don't I be right and you be wrong? All right, time to pull out that pencil or pen. Page 4. What about your own conflict management styles? Let's take a look at these. Here's what I want you to do. I'm going to read all 28 statements here on the page. This is the ROM Organizational Conflict Inventory. I want you to put next to each one of these statements the number 1 through the number 6, just one of those numbers, based on which one is most accurate for you. Number 6 will describe, if you put a 6 next to the statement, that describes your approach to conflict extremely accurately, 5 very accurately, 4 somewhat accurately, 3 somewhat inaccurately, 2 very inaccurately, or 1 extremely inaccurately. So as I go through these, think about a conflict you're having with somebody right now or you just recently had, and think about your approach to the person there. If you need a pen or a pencil, come on up and grab one. Okay. So let's look at these. Put a 1 through 6 next to these statements. The first statement, I try to investigate an issue with that person to find a solution acceptable to us. I try to investigate an issue with that person to find a solution acceptable to us. Number 2, I generally try to satisfy the needs of that person. I generally try to satisfy the needs of that person. Number 3, I attempt to avoid being put on the spot and try to keep my conflict with that person to myself. 6, extremely accurately, 1 extremely inaccurately. We're on statement 3, I attempt to avoid being put on the spot and try to keep my conflict with that person to myself. Number 4, I try to integrate my ideas with those of that person to come up with a decision jointly. I try to integrate my ideas with those of that person to come up with a decision jointly. 1 through 6. Number 5, I try to work with that person to find solutions to a problem which satisfy our expectations. I try to work with that person to find solutions to a problem which satisfy our expectations. Number 6, I usually avoid open discussion of my differences with that person. I usually avoid open discussion of my differences with that person. Number 7, I try to find a middle course to resolve an impasse. I try to find a middle course to resolve an impasse. When I run up against a brick wall, I try to find some sort of middle course. Number 8, I use my influence to get my ideas accepted. Number 8, I use my influence to get my ideas accepted. Number 9, I use my authority to make a decision in my favor. I use my authority to make a decision in my favor. Number 10, I usually accommodate to the wishes of that person. I usually accommodate to the wishes of that person. Number 11, I give in to the wishes of that person. I give in to the wishes of that person. Number 12, I exchange accurate information with that person to solve a problem together. I exchange accurate information with that person to solve a problem together. Number 13, I usually allow concessions to that person. I usually allow concessions to that person. Number 14, I usually propose a middle ground for breaking deadlocks. I usually propose a middle ground for breaking deadlocks. Number 15, I negotiate with that person so that a compromise can be reached. I negotiate with that person so that a compromise can be reached. Number 16, I try to stay away from disagreement with that person. I try to stay away from disagreement with that person. Number 17, I avoid an encounter with that person. I avoid an encounter with that person. 18, I use my expertise to make a decision in my favor. I use my expertise to make a decision in my favor. 19, I often go along with the suggestions of that person. I often go along with the suggestions of that person. 20, I use give and take so that a compromise can be made. I use give and take so that a compromise can be made. 21, I am generally firm in pursuing my side of the issue. I am generally firm in pursuing my side of the issue. 22, I try to bring all our concerns out in the open so that the issues can be resolved in the best way possible. I try to bring all our concerns out in the open so that the issues can be resolved in the best possible way. 23, I collaborate with that person for a proper understanding of the problem. I collaborate with that person for a proper understanding of the problem. 24, I try to satisfy the expectations of that person. I try to satisfy the expectations of that person. 25, I sometimes use my power to win a competitive situation. I sometimes use my power to win a competitive situation. 26, I try to keep my disagreements with that person to myself in order to avoid hard feelings. I try to keep my disagreements with that person to myself in order to avoid hard feelings. 27, I try to avoid unpleasant exchanges with that person. I try to avoid unpleasant exchanges with that person. 28, I try to work with that person for a proper understanding of the problem. I try to work with that person for a proper understanding of the problem. You just put numbers 1 through 6, either extremely inaccurately describes you, through extremely accurately 6 describes you for each of those 28 statements. Here's what I want you to do next. Put the letter A next to these statement numbers. Not the numbers you wrote, but next to these statement numbers, put the letter A. So put the letter A next to statement 3, 6, 16, 17, 26, 27. Put the letter A next to statement 3, 6, 16, 17, 26, 27. Put the letter B next to 2, 10, 11, 13, 19, and 24. Put the letter B next to 2, 10, and 11, 13, 19, and 24. Put the letter C next to 7, 14, and 15, and 20. 7, 14, and 15, and 20. Put the letter D next to 8 and 9, 18, 21, and 25. Put the letter D next to 8 and 9, 18, 21, and 25. And then put the letter E next to 1, 4, 5, 12, 22, 23, and 28. So put the letter E next to 1, 4, 5, 12, 22, 23, and 28. Everyone here know how to do averages? So if you take all the A's, you add up your numbers, 1 through 6, that you have on all the A statements, divide by the total number. A will be divided by 6, B will be divided by 6, C will be divided by 4, D by 5, and E by 7. And these will actually indicate what your preferred style of conflict management already is. And what are we talking about here? Flip over to page 5. And you can do those averages after we let you go today, as far as that goes. We won't make you, do too much math now. But if you look at page 5, A equals avoiding. So if it helps, put an A next to avoiding, B next to accommodating, C next to compromising, D next to competing, E next to collaborating. And you will notice that in the parentheses right after those styles, those approaches, are the exact same numbers. I just had you write down the letters. So what are they? Our approaches to conflict. The first, avoiding. We take the approach that conflict will just disappear if we only ignore it. This is also called denial, withdrawal, or neglect response. Now let's face it. In the American culture, nobody is ever raised with an avoiding approach to conflict. We are raised in the United States typically to have our say. You're going to hear me out. And as such, the avoiding is very culturally bound in many cases, but it's not necessarily an American cultural phenomenon. It's rarely used in the United States because we don't ever really suggest to anybody, you just decide to leave me out of it. That's not really used. How will you recognize people that are avoiding? You know these statements. You've heard some people use these. There isn't a disagreement here. Or they might say, you're creating a problem where one doesn't exist. Or one of my favorites, you're making a mountain out of a molehill. Where people are pretty much trying to ignore the fact that there might actually be a disagreement. B, accommodating. We take the approach that we do our utmost to satisfy the other person's desires, oftentimes to the complete sacrifice of our own. This is also known as obliging or the loyalty response. Now, this might be just acceptable, and there's a time and a place for every one of these, of course. And this might be just acceptable if we're talking about going with a group of people and trying to decide where we're going to go get a meal. What restaurant we're going to go get a meal. And maybe you've got a real, taste for one kind of food and everyone else wants to go someplace else. So you just accommodate. All right, that's fine. But at the extreme, this becomes a serious problem, doesn't it? Because at the extreme accommodator who's following the loyalty response is often the one who may, in bad circumstances, be the one in a relationship that's getting abused. And they stay there. For whatever reason. She loves me. He loves me. He doesn't really mean it. And that can become a problem. There's a time and place for every one of these. This isn't the time and place for an accommodating response. Compromising, C, we take the approach that our interests are incompatible and try to partially address each person's needs. This is also known as splitting the difference. And in business, this might work out just fine. And in many other places, it might work out just fine. Didn't work in the Bible at one point, though, did it? At one point in the Old Testament, there are two women who go to the king, right? Claim they both are the parent of a particular child, and the king said, give me the sword, I'll cut it in half. If you're going to compromise and split the difference, when lives are involved, all you do is have dead lives. And we'd prefer to keep a baby alive, right? Okay. You weren't talking to him, no. So at any rate, as we start to look at this, compromise has its place, but you might also recognize sometimes compromise just isn't the place for it. Competing. We learned early in the American culture that winning, sometimes at all costs, is what is important. This becomes often coercive, overly assertive, characterized by the attempt to force one's individual solution on the dispute. It's also referred to as domineering. My way or the highway. It's an all or nothing game, and as such, I'm going to play it that way. And finally, collaborating. All parties in the dispute work together to resolve conflict. An attempt is focused on to maintain a positive communication climate, positive relations, while all working toward a common goal. Conflict is viewed in a positive light, and a growth experience for both the individual and the working relationship itself. This is also referred to as a voice response or integration. Now, under most circumstances, this is preferable. However, as I said before, and let's note that in all these circumstances, they all have their place. In a military conflict, for instance, we're not going to sit and talk about collaboration. You know, at that point, one domineering group over another is going to actually have to take place because time is often of the essence. Orientations to conflict. Let's look at these for a moment. There are three orientations to conflict that we ought to pay attention to. The first one is lose-lose. And don't we see people follow this particular method all the time? You might think, well, wait a minute, what are you talking about? I'm always in the idea that I'm going to win. And in fact, some of us sometimes aren't in that mode. You know, in medieval times, so to speak, before a lot of technology, and wars were fought over ground. And we'd have one army advancing on another, and the army that was going to lose and knew it was going to lose was going to bog out, and they were going to retreat. But what were they going to do first? Oftentimes they were going to poison the well, weren't they? If I can't have the land, I'm going to make it unusable for that person as well. Do we see that sometimes in relationships with people we know today? Somebody wants to break up with somebody else, for instance, and they make the decision that if I can't have that person, nobody can, so they make it absolutely impossible for the other person to actually have a real healthy relationship thereafter. Whether it's a working relationship, whether it's a personal relationship, whatever it might be. Lose-lose. Some of us wind up taking that approach more than we care to. A win-lose orientation. It's a zero-sum game. I'm going to win and I win it all, or I'm going to lose and you win. But we don't have it both ways. And then finally, a win-win. Where does win-win wind up becoming more of a problem? Because we seem to fall back into the win-lose when egos get involved. When egos get involved. And if we sometimes step back from our own egos, we can often find ways of solving issues and conflicts. What am I talking about here? You know, there was a famous case when I was teaching at the University of Hawaii for a while. There was a famous case that was often discussed about the coconut industry. There were two factories on the islands, and still are, as I understand it. One of them in particular packaged and produced coconut milk, sent it to the stores, and kept an entire factory worth of employees at work and living well, etc. The other one actually produced baked goods with the meat of the coconut and had coconut pies and various other things in the grocery stores, and they shipped them out and things like this. And what often happened was every year there weren't that many coconuts to keep both factories in business. One factory didn't work that year because they wind up having a bidding war with the producers of the coconuts over the price of the coconuts, and it was a win-lose, zero-sum game, whereas one company wound up with all the coconuts, the other company wound up unemployed for that particular season. And when asked, why can't they work together, because splitting the coconuts in half obviously didn't work, because it wasn't enough to keep both factories alive if you did so. What often happened is these people they'd say, well, what do you need? They'd say, we need the coconuts. And they'd ask the other company, what do you need? We need the coconuts. Until somebody started asking the more detailed questions. What specifically of the coconuts are you using? And you're going to follow me very quickly on this. Because the company that actually produced the coconut milk would actually take the juice out of the middle of the coconuts and toss the rest. Likewise, the company that was making the baked goods would actually take the meat off the coconut, and while they'd open the coconuts to get to the meat, they would just let the juice, the milk of the coconut run to the drain and be done. Now, but when egos get involved, people aren't going to look at that and say, do you realize how easy of a solution this can be if you take a win-win orientation instead of a win-lose orientation? And in fact, previously, when the only people that were winning were the producers of the coconuts, because the bidding war went up, they got the nice price, and off they went. Now they've actually been able to work it out, where the coconuts go to the factory first to have the milk trade, and then somebody ships them from one factory to the other. And it took professional mediation help to figure that out. Because they wouldn't talk to each other. They wouldn't communicate. And it all comes down to what sort of communication climate did they have? Were they actually operating with each other? And could they talk to each other? Let's look at the psychology of people when egos get involved. The psychology of people when we talk about the thematic issues relative to conflict, when people are in conflict. Page 6. Number 1. An individual will behave in ways that make sense to him or her. It doesn't make any difference if you're on the other side of the conflict and looking at them and going, that doesn't make any sense. What they're doing doesn't make any sense. You know what? It makes sense to the other person. Or they wouldn't act that way. People don't act in ways that make no sense to themselves. Number 2, each individual's interpretation of reality is subjective. Well, go figure. And in fact, each individual's interpretation of reality will be different than other individuals who experience the exact same reality. Come on, think about this. If 5 people actually witnessed a car accident, and you had somebody taking the stories of all 5 people, what actually happened, you'd have 7 stories. You'd have the original 5 stories, and 2 people at least would change their mind upon further pondering. And is any one of those 7 stories probably what really happened? That'd be one variation thereof, but it wouldn't count for everything. Number 3, conflict participants use the conflict itself to make judgments about the motives of the other conflict participants. We have a tendency to actually interpret other people's motives and behavior based on the conflict we're currently engaged in. That becomes the focal point of defining who those people are. Number 4, the influence of mental processes on the perception of reality in interpersonal conflict is largely unconscious and automatic. Go figure. We're not always aware of our behavior and what we actually think about the whole thing, because we happen to be human beings who work largely on the subconscious level. Number 5, expect interpersonal conflict to be characterized by widespread subjective perception and misperception on the part of the conflict participants, which in turn contributes to the persistence of the conflict. My interpretations and your interpretations and my misinterpretations and your misinterpretations will certainly allow the conflict to continue to persist. Number 6, Each individual is motivated to improve basic well-being, happiness, comfort, and pleasure, and to minimize discomfort, pain, and damage to the self. We all act in our own best self-interest. And if we recognize that about other people, it's often a lot easier to come to terms with them about any conflict because we're paying that much more close attention. Number 7, individuals' expectations about the results that their behavior will produce are subjective. Sometimes we think we're going to have a great impact on somebody, and sometimes we begin to realize that no matter what we do, it isn't going to make any difference whatsoever. Number 8, individual choices in a conflict will be the result of reconciling numerous, diverse, frequently unconscious, and often contradictory motivations. Now, there shouldn't be any surprise there whatsoever to any of us. We're all complicated, messy human beings. There's an awful lot going on in our heads, right? Number 9, individuals in a conflict frequently don't attain their intended goals. I want world domination. I'm not going to get it. No matter who I have a conflict with. Number 10, interpersonal conflict tends to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. And here we go again. If I've got a positive view on life and I'm working on a positive communication climate, thinking I'm going to have positive results, the likelihood is I'm going to. If, on the other hand, I've got a negative view on life and think I'm going to have negative results whatever I'm doing, the likelihood is I'm going to have negative results. Now, here's the question. Do you really think positively or negatively? Now, all of us in the United States have been raised to immediately say, I'm a positive thinker. And in fact, if I put a cup here, a glass here, and I have it half filled with liquid, and I ask you, is the glass half full or half empty? Every one of us has been conditioned to respond, the glass is half full. And therefore, we're ready to pat ourselves on the back and suggest, we are positive thinkers. It's too cliche at this point, isn't it? I want you to stop and think for a moment. When we start looking at our attitude, put it in this perspective. I'm giving you a quarter. Now, you get to flip that quarter. And you get to call it in the air. There's a 50-50 chance here, right? That it's going to be heads or tails. Because we're going to assume it's not a two-headed or a two-tailed coin. 50-50 chance. Now, if you call it correctly, I'm going to give you $1 million. If you call it incorrectly, you owe me $100,000. What do you do? If your first thought was, how am I going to spend $1 million? You're probably more generally, have general tendencies toward a positive outlook. If your first thought was, I don't have $100,000, we're probably generally tending toward a negative outlook. Because if you look at the fact that we're talking about 10-to-1 odds on a 50-50 chance, terms that Vegas would never accept because they'd go broke in a day. We're talking about, think about it, how many flips does it take before you're ahead? All right, let's say, if I go 50, 50, 50, 50, what are the odds that before I hit 5, I'm going to win $1 million? Even if I've got to give up 1, 2, 300,000. Now, some of you are thinking two other things, right? Some of you might have gone right through your head saying, first off, if I understand those odds, the guy who'd be offering it to me has got to be crazy. It's $1 million first. Secondly, the other thought that might go through is, I don't gamble. Why are you asking me these questions? That may tell you something else about your outlook on life. As Aristotle said, well begun is half done. Do we truly see the glass as half full? And if we have a positive outlook from the very beginning, we've already started the well done aspect of things. All right, flip over to page 7. Constructive communication patterns during conflict. What should we be paying attention to? What are positive communication patterns when conflict arises? The first one, confirm each other by recognizing and acknowledging each other's concerns and feelings. Confirm each other by recognizing and acknowledging each other's concerns and feelings. You know, we are all, the person that you're dealing with, you wouldn't be dealing with if they didn't matter. You wouldn't be dealing with them if they didn't matter. So recognize them as being valued human beings. And make sure they're aware of it. Number 2, stay focused on the main issues. Don't get sidetracked. Number 3, bracket. Use bracketing techniques. You know, it's very important when we're having a conversation, having some sort of resolution process with someone, that if they start doing, well, what about this, and what about this, and what about this, and they start adding all these other things in the process, that wasn't the issue we came here to discuss. And if you start linking one issue to another issue, you are in a forever, never-ending debate that will go nowhere, and at that point, you're a politician. Because what you're going to wind up doing is never actually resolving anything. Bracket. That's an issue we can discuss later. At this point right now, we need to solve this one. Okay? Bracket them. Separate them. Don't let them link. Don't interrupt other people except for clarification. Let people have their say. And unless you don't completely understand something, don't interrupt them. Let them say what they need to say. Recognize and acknowledge each other's point of view. Get a dual perspective. Walk in their shoes. Be able to look through their glasses. However you want to word it, get a dual perspective and be able to acknowledge and recognize their perspective. You don't have to agree with them, but you should at least make an attempt to see it from their perspective. And finally, contract. Contract. I used to do this with my stepchildren all the time. You know, they say they want this, they want this, they want this, they want this. And I'd say, great, let's go ahead and write all this down. If you give me straight A's, if you give me a good report card this time, you can have this, 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 and this. And we write it down. I'd have the child, even though it's never binding anywhere, right? But even though it wasn't binding, I'd have the child sign it. I'd put it in my safe. So later when the child would come back and say, I want this because I did this, and when they say they did this, recognizing they only did like a quarter to a half of what they actually claimed they were going to do, then we'd pull out the piece of paper and we'd show it to them. Now, at this point, you have the option, right, of either being really merciful and showing a lot of grace, and even though they didn't complete everything, giving them what they've asked for, or holding them accountable and teaching them accountability and responsibility from the very beginning, and saying, well, you got a couple more things you need to do. Do you remember writing this? Do you remember signing this? And all of a sudden, the aha moment starts in. When we talk about conflict, we talk about crisis, one of the things we need to recognize also is the fact, and I think it's interesting and telling, when we look at the Chinese character for crisis, and I'm going to call this the Chinese character for conflict as well, the first part of that character is danger, and the second part is opportunity. And I'm not suggesting by any means that we ought to embrace conflict and go running toward it. But on the other hand, when some people tell us, you know, my divorce, my getting fired was the best thing that ever happened to me because they were able to take times of crisis and turn it into something better for themselves. Okay? When it happens, turn it into an opportunity. And again, that comes from perspective. That comes from actually developing a perspective specific for that. Page 8, let's look at conflict management skills. Number 1, we should and always should pay attention to and attend to the relationship level of meaning. Meaning lies within people, not within words. And if meaning lies within people, one of the things we need to recognize and attend to is the fact that how we perhaps somehow manage this particular conflict. We could win a battle and lose a war. We could win this little quarrel and lose a relationship. And sometimes the relational level of meaning in any conflict or interaction has a lot to do with the idea that this may or may not allow, based on how this is managed, we may or may not have a relationship to continue. Number 2, we should communicate supportively. Supportive communication usually includes descriptive communication, not evaluative communication. Provisional communication, spontaneous communication. Spontaneous, not memorized in advance. How many of us get into a conflict and we got something to say to somebody, so we practice a speech and get given? How often does that work for you? Usually not ever. Spontaneous communication, problem-oriented communication, empathic communication, and egalitarian communication. We should recognize people as being equals. Listen mindfully. Own your feelings, thoughts, and issues. Own your feelings, thoughts, and issues. You know, the worst thing that you can ever say in any conflict whatsoever is to start the words in the sentence off with, "You make me." Because what you have done is you have specifically gone out of your way to give up all your power. You've handed them power over you. You've handed them control. You make me, there's a problem. It's much better to own your feelings, your thoughts, and your issues. You know, I feel this way when I recognize that I have control of my feelings, and as such, I feel this way, and I need to deal with it perhaps, but this is what's happening. Check perceptions. Perceptions are easily distorted when feelings get high. Paraphrase back what they said. Ask questions, but be very careful because questions and paraphrasing, if said with the right tone, can sound awfully accusing. You know, one of the things that always strikes me as interesting when we talk about people trying to talk and deal with conflict is that we often start off with points of disagreement. We don't agree on this, and we don't agree on this, and we don't agree on this. And by the time we finish with that list of the points of disagreement, we've set a pattern for ourselves to continue to disagree. And it's that much easier to dig in our heels because we've now gone ahead and put out there all the places we don't. I'm going to challenge you today that with the next time you get into a conflict with somebody, start off that conversation with all the points that you agree on. Because when you start off with all the points that you agree on, again, you're setting a pattern for yourself. When you set the behavioral pattern for yourself on all the points that you agree on, believe it or not, it will often make the points that you disagree on seem less of an issue and easier to work out because you begin to realize you agree on more than you disagree on. Look for ways to preserve the other's face. You know, we talk about face as being embarrassment. We talk about face as being shame. How do I save other people from being embarrassed? And can I do that? And it often takes a lot of grace on our part to do that. But if you look at the last one, imagine how you're going to feel in the future. Tomorrow, next week, 5 years from now, 20 years from now, based on how you handle this particular conflict. Is that relationship going to be better or dead? And if you've given people the grace and the option to save their face and save them from embarrassment, it's going to go that much further for you. And then we wind up being able to not have to deal with this cartoon at the bottom of page 8, right? For the last time, it's called a win-win contract. Nobody gets whacked. Page 9. So, helpful hints today. Focus on the overall communication system. Time conflict purposely. Don't wait till somebody's getting ready to run out to an important meeting and then say, we need to talk. Recognize that gender research, for example, suggests that women who are raised, generally speaking, this isn't everyone, but women who are raised, generally speaking, are raised with what kind of toys? Dolls and cookware and things like this that actually foster small talk and talk about feelings and talk about thinking and what women are thinking, etc. How are men and boys usually raised? Generally speaking, not everyone, of course. They're often raised with tools and machinery and guns and sports equipment and things like this. That's all about doing and activity. And their talk is often centered around problem orientation and solutions and how to accomplish and doing, not about thinking and feeling. And as such, because of that, by the time men and women in conversation become adults, one of the things we need to recognize is that when conflict actually happens, women want to talk about it right now. Men don't. They need time to process because they're not accustomed to it. So when we talk about trying to find an opportunity for compromise, we need to recognize that some people need to be more patient about when to approach things and time right, and other people need to step up a little bit quicker. Aim for win-win conflict. Honor yourself, your partner, and the relationship. You wouldn't be in conflict if you didn't care about each other. So honor yourself, your partner, and the relationship. And as we talked about already at some point, show grace when it's appropriate. And what is grace? Grace, what we're talking about, is that beyond social custom and our current culture, our culture is set up where we are to forgive how often, etc., etc. And there comes a point when maybe we shouldn't necessarily have to. That's where grace kicks in. When we show grace to others and give them perhaps more mercy or more kindness than sometimes we think that they deserve, oftentimes that can go a long way to preserving a relationship. So we're not battling in the same canoe and paddling in different directions. Because finally, when we start looking at all these issues, we're able to answer that question, those questions at the end of on page 10 here. Are we trying to build a relationship or build a case? Or are we trying to fix the problem or fix the blame? Win the battle, win the war. Or win the battle, lose the war. Win the quarrel, lose the relationship. Working relationship, romantic relationship. Any questions today? I always promise to have you in and out in an hour. It looks like we've been able to do that as well. Okay, before I shut off the microphone, I'm going to be reminded, so I'll go ahead and remind you before I'm reminded to remind you to fill out those evaluations, if you would please, and give them to the ladies up front. And I thank you ever so much for your time for coming today.